Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Ludwigsburg. Today's talk, I wanted to walk people through a set of models on how I think about open source projects and nonprofits, because I think it's really important to have models in your head so you understand what hat am I wearing in what conversation. Some of these ideas came from a German philosopher and sociologist named Ferdinand Tönnies, and that's where the title of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft comes from. That was supposed to do something. That's what it was supposed to do. I've been doing standards and open source software for a long time. As Carla said, I've been doing this for more than 30 years, this idea of engineers collaborating in a room together. And the context has almost always been as a product engineer. And so that's what informs a lot of where these ideas came from. And as all good engineers, you eventually hit that point where, because we're always kind of doing things from first principles, surely there's a better way to figure out how this community thing works. And then you start realizing somebody must have studied this, and you think, aha, the sociologists, they must know how community works better than the rest of us. Which brings us to Ferdinand Tönnies. He was a mid-19th century to mid-20th century philosopher and sociologist, one of that early group of social thinkers. And in 1887, he wrote Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And the idea behind this is Gemeinschaft, that's your community. That's this inner circle. It's comprised of personal social ties. And things are done because everybody kind of knows the social rules in that group of people. And it's cooperative. It's the village we live in. Gesellschaft, on the other hand, remember, this is a period of history where people are fleeing into the cities. Gesellschaft is all about society. And society is all about rules and laws. It's impersonal. It's indirect connections between people. It's guided by very formal values that have a lot to do with efficiency and economics and political science. And these are not mutually exclusive. You think about your neighborhood in your city, and that has a very different feel to it than the city itself. And they're also, they were quick, Ferdinand was quick to talk about the idea these are ideal types. But it gives us a metaphor for how to think about some of this. So I want to talk about this idea of, how does an open source project actually work? What's the model for how we get stuff done? And then, what's the purpose of an open source nonprofit? We keep creating these things. We keep spinning up new working groups inside of existing ones. There's this constant growth and acceleration right now. So I want to walk you back to this where it all starts. It starts with maintainers and working software. And it's published outbound. You're sharing outbound innovation. And you can have no expectation of anything in return. Nothing. The license says so. So this idea of all the whining that goes on out there of people saying, well, they have to give us something. No, they don't. You published your innovation outbound. You shared it outbound under the license. And projects have a culture at this level. And that culture and governance tends to be around the software itself. It's the software engineering, it's the construction maturity. If you want to capture innovation inbound, you have to do the work of building a community. And that's building the on-ramps. You can have no expectation of something in return, but you can build the on-ramps for new users, developers to enable them to do selfish things, and stepping up into turning them into contributors. And if you do that, you can capture innovation inbound. And communities, again, we're still talking that community level. We're still talking about it might be very formal in terms of its documentation. The Kubernetes project is rigorous in how they document their processes. The Linux kernel, equally vigorous community, not so much. I think all of us would be hard-pressed to find the website that describes this. And so but a lot of this still boils down to a set of activities along these two axes, one around community development, one around software construction. And again, we're still narrowing it down to, okay, there's an on-ramp for you, encouraging users, encourage the developers, and then encourage the contributors. And I always keep coming back down to one of the worst things I see out there is all of this magic thinking around this idea of a community, that somehow, if we did an open source project, this magical community will show up. And I keep having to teach people that there is no community except for the one you build. That's the only community that you can trust. But somehow, nonprofits have a role to play, right? And when we look at this, Henrik Ingo is a member of the broader open source community, and a dozen years ago when our numbers were smaller, he did a big number crunch. The link at the bottom of the slide there, he's a good engineer. He lays out all of his assumptions, where he got his data from, the calculations he did. And at the time, he was able to demonstrate that the 9 most vibrant large projects were hubbed inside of foundations. He's still a good engineer. He did not claim causality. But clearly, there's a correlation. They have a purpose. And I'd like to suggest what that purpose is. If we have this stylized idea of what the evolution of a project looks like. You've got the project, there's maintainers, and then you find your contributors, you build a community, you end up at an ecosystem. That's this great idea. But something happens along the way. You end up with corporate contributors show up, and they're looking for something that looks a little more stable. If they're going to include this software in their products and services, they're looking for stability. And at the same time, you're getting to a size where even though you're doing everything right, the maintainers are taking on a larger and larger personal liability. And so the evolution basically stops. And it's kind of a hard stop, actually. But if you go and you build a nonprofit is this great tool that solves for these problems. It deals with, it's a legal structure that allows you to protect the maintainers, it removes their personal liability, and at the same time it provides a shell of stability around the assets, which means that corporate contributors can now feel a little safer getting involved. And a very similar thing happens when you start looking at corporate projects. And again, there's this kind of idealized idea that we're all gonna work on this together. It's going to be great. And this time, though, instead of that simple, maintainers and then contributors, you've got engineering, you've also got your partners, you've got some customers. The reality is it's actually a real fledgling project. You have no idea if this is going to work. And the reality is even worse than this because your competitors are in the room with you now. And again, how do you deal with this? Well, again, there's this idea, the second set of problems, different problems to solve, but you can still solve them with a nonprofit. A nonprofit, it doesn't just provide you a holder of assets, a legal place to park those assets. It provides neutrality. So you can signal to all of those partners that, I'm not asking you to come and work on my stuff and build my stuff for me. We're going to move the assets into this neutral nonprofit, and that's a place that we can all collaborate together. At the same time, as soon as you start talking about getting a whole pile of contributors, a whole lot of partners together in a room, you need antitrust protection now, because otherwise people can claim that bad conversations are happening. So nonprofits they solve a really fundamental problem here, and again, as a model. So you've got a culture around building software, sharing innovation outbound. You've got a culture around building the community and capturing innovation inbound. And then you've got this additional culture around building a healthy nonprofit. And you can have somebody that wears all 3 hats. But in wearing all 3 hats, they need to know which hat they're wearing in which discussion. Now, I've said culture a number of times in this. This is my definition of culture. It's a collection of beliefs and practices of a community which evolves carefully and creates success across the generations. And across the generations is the big aha for a number of us over this last couple of years, because we've seen some really successful project cultures that are starting to fail because they never thought about that across the generations problem. And so, kind of finishing up here is this idea that culture is really important. You've got that basic culture of enabling work when you're still down at that project level. You've got a culture of enabling contribution when you step up into the community level. And then you've got a separate culture again to worry about around this idea of promoting stability, and a culture around organizational excellence and organizational responsibility when you step up into that space around a nonprofit. And the base culture under each of those things that's really critical and really important is that culture of mentoring new members so that they know how to be successful in your community or in your nonprofit. And some organizations, Eclipse does a phenomenal job of that. I got to tell you, as somebody that's been working in the Eclipse SDV working group, Eclipse as an organization does an amazing job of that culture education and that cultural mentoring. Bringing it back, to the title, there is that idea of, on one side, when we're talking about the project, when we're talking about community, it is very much a project community we're talking about. We're in a village. It behaves very differently from the legal structure when you step up into a nonprofit. So, we're coming back to Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft again. And I think this is so critical for us to start to think about and understand right now, because we're in an acceleration. We're seeing more and more new vertical industries stepping into the open source space. And they have an overly simplistic view of what collaboration actually looks like. And they think, if I just go to a nonprofit, I'll have a Kubernetes. And there's so much more involved in doing all the hard work that everybody in this room lives in that space, from either being in a project and being a member of that project's PMC, all the way up through being part of that community around the project, all the way up through the staff and the members of the nonprofit that is Eclipse. Because we're seeing this acceleration happen time and time and time again as more and more of these new industry verticals come racing into the software space, wanting to collaborate and not knowing how. The last kind of thing I want to finish on is this idea that, really we're playing a long-term infinite game here. For those of you that know anything about infinite games, the point is that the game continues to play. And for that to work, you have to have trust in the participants. There is no end condition. You don't get to win an infinite game. The point is the play. And any competitive behavior, it's finite game, any competitive behavior that shows up in an infinite game environment, it breaks the trust. And in breaking the trust, it breaks down the integrity of the entire organization, regardless of whether it's a project, a community, or a nonprofit. It's enormously damaging. And so I'd like to leave everybody on that idea, and that's all I have to say about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Thanks very much, folks.